It was around the time when I was frantically searching through my notes to figure out which of the kings would be liked by a Sabinian and at which date that king came into power, whilst cross-referencing it with the information I'd learned from those critical of that king, that I knew hellisus had its claws in me. By the time I'd finished the game, I had a Google Doc that was 15 pages long, filled with little notes, images, and theories. It's a game that is more than happy for you to get stuck, and it trusts you to really figure out the solution. It's an experience I'm glad I had no help with, and may just be one of my favourites of this year. Here's what happened when I played hellisus. First, I've recently just hit 4,000 subscribers, so I just want to say if you're new or if you've been around for a while, thank you so much. So let's give you a quick rundown before we get into it. hellisus places you in the unenviable shoes of Remy, a man who grew up in Hadia, a land torn apart by civil war, who comes back to find his parents. Captured by a rather menacing man hooked up to a polygraph, you are telling the story of what happened when you arrived. Remy was a member of a peacekeeping force, and he went rogue when the peacekeepers pulled out of the region. You have to explore the tension between the two groups caught up in a civil war, the history of both, and the vacuum left when that peacekeeping force left. The game really explores what these themes means. It's broadly about war, but it feels less interested in taking a side and more interested in challenging you, debating you into peeling back the layers of bias, propaganda, and belief that inform said groups. The Sabinians and the Palamists use the same land, they believe in the same god, but where the Sabinians are more New Age, Palamists are dyed in the wool. Or Palamists are oppressors and Sabinians are the oppressed, or Palamists have a rightful claim to the land and Sabinians defile it with their beliefs. A brutal leader closed off Hadia to the outside world, but some argue his force kept a tight lid on everything, ready to burst out. When he died, everything he'd barely suppressed came rushing to the surface. And most people with super strong opinions on one or the other are caught in the crossfire. Those who are most impartial are most disconnected. This fuels a very cyclical violence that permeates every inch of the game. It's a very bitter one. The very first NPC you come across is a weary farmer who's had to bury 3 of his children, and now all he has left is his faith, both religious and political. He's also kind of bloodthirsty despite his meager appearance. You are directly told at many points to question pretty much every piece of information you're given at all moments, and this is something made so much better by the gameplay. It's a very open-ended game. You are given a purpose, let loose on semi-open areas, but more or less told to guide yourself. In the pause menu, you will find an investigation tab, and this links back to your purpose, but it's actually all rather vague. You're effectively given a spider graph of characters, items, locations, and all of these elements get more information tacked on as you learn it. But it will never directly tell you where to go. There are no waypoints. Maps can be found, but you can't find a player icon on them, and they can be pretty hard to read. You do get a compass, but directions are rarely given in cardinal. So you may be wondering, how does hellisus let you know where to go then? I'm tempted to say it doesn't and leave it at that, but it actually does and does so well. It just does it a little differently. Every major NPC has not only questions you can ask them related to investigations, but you can also ask general knowledge questions for their opinions on the war, who is at fault, and some knowledge on the region. Through these conversations, you not only add to your investigation and get a rundown of political feelings, but you also get nuggets of information that actually lead you places. It helps that, despite there being quite a few regions and a decent amount of each map to explore, the game is small enough that you can almost systematically comb through it. On the flip side, sometimes exploration can feel a tad confused, and I think this is partially due to some textures looking quite similar. It also gives you shortcuts that aren't really shortcuts at all. Where the likes of a Souls-like often employs a shortcut to give you a quick level up, the fact that hellisus doesn't have this kind of level structure means I often opened up to older areas to immediately ignore it and attempt to entirely forget that it exists so as not to confuse me. What the game does well is give you specific landmarks with intentional iconography, so when you get given a key or some other mechanism, you can pause and think about where you've seen that before. This is just one reason you should keep notes. Another is that the puzzles themselves can genuinely be engaging and interesting. From reading through books, to placing events on a historical timeline, to tweaking a radio to just the right frequency, It gave me the same feeling of figuring out the world that the likes of Silent Hill or Resident Evil do. And like Silent Hill, I was often placed in a room, given a couple of bits of information and told to figure it out or you're going nowhere. My Google Doc is largely filled with symbols and phrases, tying together things I've been told with countering information, and what puzzles do well is allow you to play around with a kind of logical negative space. For example, one puzzle has you place a handful of historic moments in one leader's life on a graph to get a code, but it's not nearly that simple. The maker of the code suddenly had an epiphany and decided to swap one around with another that hasn't been revealed to you. So not only do you have to figure out all those moments, but you have to figure out the missing one and replace it with another one you've already seen. Despite me likely overcomplicating this one, I constantly found myself saying, I'm an idiot, 2 seconds after figuring puzzles out. Because despite playing with expectations, I never found myself stuck on one that I couldn't ultimately admit was a bit obvious in hindsight. I think there's a version of me that figures this out immediately, and a version that takes 20 minutes, and which version it is likely depends on which piece of information I catch as I start. I loved this, and it made me feel like I was actually getting involved in figuring out the world. To me, these kinds of puzzles and this type of world building that literally demands you open your ears and listen is far more immersive than super detailed graphics or killer sound. With hellisus being built on UE5 and given some performance woes in earlier demos, I was a tad afraid it would be a bit choppy, but on my rig, and you can see the specs on screen, I ran the game on very high from start to finish and had maybe a handful of stutters total. It was a smoother experience than I was expecting, and it's also quite a polished game outside of this. I ran into not one glitch pre-launch and found a single spelling mistake in the entire thing. Graphically, I don't think it's majorly impressive, but it does manage to catch colour where it needs to and looks fittingly grimy elsewhere. The sound is great though. It pulses, it chimes, there are plenty of sound cues that aid exploration, but are never necessary for it, and enemies you fight have this otherworldly sound to them, which makes them feel almost alien. This feels intentional to me. Despite being about civil war, which is a very familial type of war between neighbors, family, etc., you don't kill humans. You kill abstractions of humans, things that take on a humanoid shape but aren't given the same feelings, drives, and societal prescriptions as everyone else. They feel almost closer to an animal in this context, something roaming specific areas, looking to gnaw on you should you give them the chance, and your gun, something that gives any so-called peacekeeping operation authority, does nothing. You are forced to play by their rules and use limbic weapons. This central focus on melee combat will naturally draw Souls-like comparisons, but I wouldn't actually call hellisus a Souls-like. It doesn't have a focus on death, it's not super challenging. Though some enemies respawn, there's no bonfire system, and only a handful of enemies seem to respawn based on timing and not any other action. You can also take actions to entirely clear some areas, and enemies will never come back after that. The narrative is more straightforward and linear, even if you have to make up your mind on what you believe. There isn't a Souls-type currency to level up, in fact you don't level up at all. This doesn't mean comparisons to elements aren't fair, it is melee focused of course, and stamina management is very important. hellisus manages to make health management even more important though, as your health bar and stamina bar match. The lower your health, the lower your max stamina. Though you get healing items, you can actually play through the entire game without using any. That's because you can earn HP by doing enough damage to an enemy and then effectively banking it with the right rhythm. When you get this down, you will find yourself taking on enemies just to restore health. It's a great system and one that makes a decent combat system feel more satisfying. Though you don't level up, you can upgrade your gear. You can get limbic shards from enemies and bring them to a blacksmith to infuse weapons with certain attributes and unlock higher levels for that gear. You then level up that gear by hitting enemies. So it does have an experience system, but only for weaponry. You can then also find and upgrade defensive gear, which gives you damage absorption and other stat boosts, plus relics that give passive and active effects. With all of these, I never found myself roadblocked by combat playing on the standard difficulty. hellisus reminded me less of my time with Dark Souls, and actually more reminded me of playing Stalker, in a weird way. It has this focus on the world, one where you have to rely on talking to others to figure it out, and it has so much you can just miss. As well as having investigations to get through the main story, it has good deeds where you can help out civilians, mysteries where you unlock certain ancient chests and relics, and then time loops, where anger and death are trapped in a bubble in time and you have to clear out guardians around a map in order to make your way in and close it. Some enemies have hazes, which are effectively crystallized emotions that make them impervious to damage until you destroy said emotion. Even combat ties back to that cyclical theming, though maybe smashing emotions with a blade feels a bit strange with that in mind. Remy doesn't have all that much to say, and that leaves him as a vessel for the rest of the world to operate through. Stories are rarely self-contained. You don't go into an area, find a quest, do the quest in that area, and then leave. Instead, you find bits scattered throughout the world, flicking back and forth to slot them all together. It makes you feel lost, yet the tightness of the world made me feel like I was constantly moving forward regardless. It doesn't punish you for missing stories either. Instead, hellisus does an excellent job of teaching you its iconography, all the little bespoke parts of the world that have a reason for existing. Rewatching my footage from early game, I caught signs and symbols emblazoned on structures. It all felt rather dreamlike thanks to an utterly cohesive world. What feels so impressive about it is how well thought out all of these little elements are. The investigation tab is not only a handy way of displaying the world, but by the end almost feels like a flex. Look how well connected every single bit is. It taunts me as I go through and finish one more good deed. It somehow manages to feel utterly brutal without feeling exploitative or for shock either. I've had conversations with a little girl who told me her dad said she would grow back her hand if she's good, all while propaganda pumped through the airwaves. I've seen mass graves and heard tales of sexual exploitation, yet it all feels like it's there to contribute to the story of this torn state. It didn't feel gratuitous or emotionally manipulative. It all paints onto a broader canvas that feels very real. I think one thing I really appreciate about Hell Is Us is how brave that all feels. The narrative itself is rather on the nose, but always sincerely, and I think that's worth noting. Saying war is hell doesn't feel particularly revelatory, but it puts forward a broader world that does. It gives you understandings, empathizes with so many types of people. There are so many elements to this that I fully understand if it will turn someone off. It feels willingly abrasive to serve a broader narrative and intent, and one that I adored by the end. I can't help but feel, though, that abrasiveness is part of what makes the game so charming. Wandering around a world, looking for that last piece I'm missing, cross-referencing files to figure out how to get into a safe, feeling stuck only for it to finally click. That sense of relief is embodied by a world that just feels never-ending. You often feel like you're unplugging a political and emotional toilet, and you just can't seem to reach the end, but even if it can get messy, the journey was worth it. I do think the ending could feel a tad stronger, given how enchanting some of the conspiracy around its central moments are, but it's also the kind of game I could imagine being quite different on replay or 100%, so I'm holding some judgment for that moment. The idea of bringing a notepad to a game can be a tad exhausting for some, but I sort of love the fact that I didn't just get a story with Hell Is Us, or a feeling as the controller vibrated in my hand whilst cutting down enemies. I've picked up a muscle memory, one that tells me to flip to certain pages if I see certain symbols. It's an engrossing game, and one I think I'll struggle to shake off. Thank you for watching my video on Hell Is Us. This was a fun one to go through, really. The turnaround on embargo was a little tight, so I decided to miss it by a day, just to give a little extra time to think about it, to go back in and explore the world a little more. And I'm sort of glad I did, because things have been shaping a lot since, and I imagine they will going forward too. I don't know if this will be the last video I make on the game. I might dig into its politics or its themes or any other manner of things, but I really like this one. And I think due to it being quite abrasive and all the other elements, I do think it might be overlooked when it comes to Game of the Year conversations, but I think there is someone out there where this will be undisputably theirs. And I think that feels important. It feels good that that kind of game can exist, one that is willing to just put people off. And it didn't for me. I liked it a lot. Anyway, so I don't just keep talking about the game. Recently we hit 4,000 subscribers. That is phenomenal to me. And I just really, really appreciate everyone who's taken the time to listen, taken the time to like, taken the time to tell me what they think, and of course subscribe. We've gone from 500 or 600 at the start of the year to 4,000. And I just can't fathom, I can't fathom that amount of people. It is truly wild to me. If you want to see that number get a little higher, I guess I'm aiming for 4,500 for the end of the year. That'd be lovely. If you want to see that number happen, then subscribing would really help me out. Thank you.